Hi, I'm Jeff Stark. I'm the director and counselor at the Life Enrichment Christian Counseling Center and also a staff counselor on John Applegate and Associates located in Philadelphia. This is the third video in a series of videos that are titled Trials. And our concern is to learn what God would want us to know about our trials because trials are a part of our everyday life. And we've been looking at the book of James, the Epistle of James, because James, right from the very first chapter, begins to address trials. And he brings us godly advice and understanding and knowledge about trials that's crucial to our living, our day-to-day life before others and before God. James begins by telling us that we face all kinds of various trials. Sometimes they're large, sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small, sometimes they're easy, sometimes they're hard, sometimes they're painless, lots of times they're very, very painful. But there's a lot of different trials that Christians go through. But James also helpfully points out to us that the trials serve one purpose. Every trial that we face serves one purpose, and that is to draw us near to God. It's a testing of our faith, is the way that James puts it. And so every trial is meant to cause us to stop relying on ourselves, but in the trial to rely on God, to turn from confidence in ourselves to confidence in Him, and to turn from faith in ourselves to faith in God. That's the purpose of trials. We also found that when we draw near to God in that way, in our hearts, God draws near to us, James chapter 4, verse 8 says, and when He comes and draws near to us, He helps us. He gives us grace. He infuses into us grace, mercy, patience, perseverance, endurance, love, and other fruits of the Spirit that are very, very helpful to us when we're going through trials. Humanly speaking, when we're going through hard trials, we don't respond and react very well. But James is saying in those similar trials, in those same trials, if we draw near to God and rely and trust and depend and draw near to Him in our hearts, He will draw near to us and give us grace or mercy and other fruits that will help us to do well and be good even in difficult trials. Remembering also that we saw in the second video that it's bad circumstances are not the reason why we respond badly. You know, if you ask the average Christian, hey, why did you react so badly to your children in that situation? They would typically say, well, my children are bad. That's why I reacted badly. They didn't obey me. They didn't respect me. They didn't do what I wanted them to do. They were disrespectful. And because of that, I reacted the way that I did. But the way I reacted was because of them. Or we could come up with 100 other illustrations. Why did you shout and scream and yell at your husband, slam the door, kick him? Whatever. And she might say, are you kidding me? Do you know what he said to me? Do you know what he did to me? Do you know how he behaved toward me? He got what he deserved because of the way that he was treating me. So most people would say that the reason I act and react badly in bad situations is because of the bad situation. James is saying something very, very different, very contrary to that. He's saying, no, the reason we act badly is because of what's going on in our heart, not what's going on in our circumstances. Or in other words, we can refer to Luke chapter 6, which we did last time, where Jesus says if the root of a tree is good, the tree is going to bear good fruit. If the root of the tree is bad, the fruit is going to be bad. And Jesus says that the root of a person is his heart. And he's saying that if your heart is good, your fruit is going to be good. If your heart is bad, your fruit is going to be bad. So, how can we be good in a bad situation? It has little to do with our circumstances, but it has everything to do with what's going on in our heart. If we're in a bad situation, but our hearts are trusting, relying, and depending and drawing near to God and prayerful, we will be able to respond well with fruit and with goodness, even when we are in a very, very bad situation. Now, that's by way of review of our first and our second video, again titled Trials, and this is the third video. Today in our third video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a very remarkable story, but it's really not all that remarkable in the sense that, well, I'll tell you about that at the end. Anyway, in Acts chapter 6 and 7 and 8, we find a man, a Christian, who is going through, who is in a trial, is being falsely accused of certain things. And at the end of the trial, this person, this man, this Christian, is going to be stoned to death. And so we have a man who's under an extremely difficult trial. Okay, you know the story. Probably in Acts chapter 6, we're told about a story about a man named Stephen. Stephen was a Christian. And we're told very early on in the story that the disciples, the apostles, were looking to appoint men as deacons, and they found some qualified men, and and Stephen happened to be one of those men. Stephen was described in chapter 6 in this way. He said that Stephen was chosen to be one of these men because he was a man full of faith and full of the Holy Spirit. So anyway, Stephen is chosen to be one of these deacons, but it became evident in time that the religious leaders found Stephen, what they thought that he was preaching blasphemy. So they pick Stephen, they pull him in front of the leaders, and they ask Stephen, or they command Stephen to give an account as to why he's blaspheming against God, against the Jewish nation, and against the law of God. Well, Stephen, we're told, who is at this point in verse 8, a man full of grace, he begins to preach a very bold and courageous sermon. And at the end of the sermon, he gets very blunt, and he points the finger at the Pharisees and the leaders and says, "You're the ones who crucified Christ, the Son of God." Well, they are very, very furious at this, and they drag him, and they take him outside, presumably. And we're told that they pick up stones, and they start to stone him. And before he dies, at the result of being stoned, what Stephen cries out is basically, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Do not hold this sin against this group of people who are unjustly, unfairly, and unrighteously stoning me and putting me to death." Those were his last words. So here's the question I'd like to raise. Stephen is in a very, 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 very intense trial. It's actually a life and death trial. But within this space of 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, two qualities are coming out of Stephen that are very remarkable. Number one is he has great boldness and courage to speak and to preach a sermon to the Pharisees, the religious rulers at the time, to talk to them about the gospel and how they rebelled against the gospel, and they rebelled against God. They rebelled against God's chosen one, and they actually put him to death. He was extremely bold and filled with courage. Those are fruits of the Spirit, by the way. And secondly, the second quality that we find in this story with Stephen is the last words that are coming out of his mouth are loving words and kind words and merciful words. "Father, do not hold this sin against them." So my question is where do these acts come from? We have a man in his circumstances that he's going through very bad and difficult, adverse circumstances, yet what's coming out of him is boldness and courage and love and forgiveness and kindness. How's that possible? Well, it proves to us that our circumstances are not the cause of whether we respond well or whether we respond badly. Remember, in the earlier part of this video, I said there's a man who responded badly to his kids, and I asked him, "Well, why did you respond so badly? Why'd you get so angry at your kids?" He said, "It was because of my kids," right? "My kids were bad. That's why I got angry." Wait a minute. That's not true. Stephen responded well in a very bad situation. Why? Well, because his root was grounded in the gospel. He was a man of faith, strong in faith and strong in grace. And out of that faith and out of that grace, he responded boldly and courageously and lovingly because of what was going on in his root. He had a good root. He was in a bad situation, but he had a good root, and out of that good root came good things such as courage and boldness and love and forgiveness and kindness. There's a lesson to be learned here. Most of us are not going to be going through the same kinds of things that Stephen's going through, although there are places in the world where people are being put to death just like Stephen, because the same reason for Stephen, and that is because he's a Christian. But these people, if they're strong in faith and their root is strong in faith and grace, they are also going to be able to respond well in those circumstances as Stephen was. Now, and the challenge is for us to do the same thing. Most of us in America are not going to be being put to death, but we are going to be facing trials every day. Little ones, small ones, or maybe sometimes excruciatingly difficult and painful ones. But nonetheless, what we can learn from all of the scriptures, and including the story of Stephen, that our circumstances do not cause us to behave well or behave poorly. Rather, whether we respond well or whether we respond poorly is really originates in our heart. If our heart is bad in a bad situation, then we're going to respond badly, probably with anger, impatience, annoyance, frustration, rudeness, criticalness, judgmentalness, with anxiety, whatever, things like that. But if we're in a bad situation, but we're drawing near to God, we're trusting, relying, and depending upon Him, approaching the throne of grace to get help and continuing to pray and ask God to draw near to us, He does draw near to us. And as we saw in the life of Stephen here, that even in the worst of situations, if we are drawing near to God in that way, He will help us to what will come out of us by God's grace will be grace, graciousness, it will be mercy, it will be patience, it will be kindness, it will be love. These are the things that we need to know. We need to own these things. We need to practice these things. We need to know these things deeply so that as we go through our trials in the course of an average day, we have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, that we wouldn't blame the bad way that we respond in those difficult trials on our circumstances, but rather we would learn to recognize those trials, that we would learn to draw near to the throne of grace as we're exhorted to do in Hebrews chapter 4, that we would follow James's advice and to draw near by faith to God in those trials, so that we in difficult trials could respond well with patience and with kindness and with graciousness and well. Okay, so Stephen's a great example of showing us that we can be in very, very difficult trials, but we can still respond well because we know that how we respond and how we react is not going to be dependent upon our circumstances, but really what's going on in our hearts. And if we can draw near to God into the throne of grace in our trials, God will draw near to us and enable us to be patient and kind and loving, even as Stephen was in the most difficult of circumstances. I hope that's helpful to you. I'm confident that it is. Practice that. Examine that. Try that. See that. Practice that in your own life and see if God doesn't come through for you. I'm sure He will. And help you in an identical way that He helped Stephen in a very difficult situation. Thanks for listening.